nerds. We took a little bit of a hiatus, but we are back on track here. So I am Agent Smith, aka Tyler, one of your hosts.
And I'm Charlie, aka Captain Rogers.
And as always, this is Nerdy by Nature. We thank you for listening. And if you listened to our last episode, we had promised you a full review of Watchmen, the graphic novel. Of course, due to some unforeseen circumstances, we had to cut that particular episode, and we are doing a hybrid episode where we're going to do some callbacks and referencing to the graphic novel, and more so focus on the recently released Watchmen TV series that just launched on HBO, and that was on October the 20th. And episode 1 was enjoyable for a lot of us who have read the graphic novel. So if you haven't read the graphic novel, I don't want to say, Charlie, that it's essential to read the graphic novel and then watch the TV series, but I do think it would be beneficial to read the graphic novel first.
Definitely.
And then watch episode 1, or at least if you've already watched episode 1 and you're like, well, this seems interesting, but there were some moments that didn't quite make sense, or I've watched Watchmen the movie, but there were still some parts that maybe it's been a while since you've watched that movie. You may want to go back and watch it again and read the graphic novel. So we would recommend that you definitely at least do one or the other before picking up this particular TV series, because there are some callbacks that I think a lot of people, I know we appreciated, that we'll talk about on this episode. But I think right out of the gate, it's off to a good start. And I also think it's important to note that the average TV watcher that might watch this particular show may not get into it right away and may not stick with it. So that's why I wanted to definitely make sure we address that right out of the gate, that this is kind of for DC fanboys and fangirls that have read the graphic novel. I think will appreciate it more than the average TV watcher. I don't know, but this will have a Game of Thrones type following.
Yeah, they in watching the first episode, you can definitely tell that this is very much a world that would have progressed after the end of either the movie or the graphic novel, and there are things that happen in the episode that would be callbacks to the graphic novel, and then there's things that happen that would be callbacks to the movie. But because the movie was a very, very strong adaptation from the graphic novel, yes, there was some stuff left out, but for the most part, it was probably the most accurate to its source material that I've ever seen.
And I have to agree with that. I think in some instances there was even scenes that were stripped right from the panel onto the big screen.
Definitely.
Which was pretty cool. And of course, the biggest change that I suppose rubbed some traditionalists the wrong way, and certainly Alan Moore, which I don't know that he's ever actually been happy with a movie adaptation of any of his works.
Yeah, I don't think he has, and which is an interesting part of the show. In watching the show, I consciously watched the very end during the credits to see if his name was anywhere, which I know that he didn't want his name anywhere on this show, but it was still odd to me to see the absence of his name. I mean, it definitely shows Dave Gibbons and says co-creator Dave Gibbons, but it never says Alan Moore anywhere, and that was just really jarring to me to see.
Right, you almost expect to see his name because it is so iconic, and he is the godfather of graphic novels, among other things, such as A Wizard, etc., etc. So, it was odd to not see it, but on the same hand, knowing his history with how he usually doesn't appreciate direct film or TV adaptations, not necessarily surprising. But what surprised some people, to go back to my earlier point about the big change in the movie from the graphic novel, is of course, if you read the graphic novel, and I should probably at this point go ahead and say, spoiler alert, we're about to go right into the review of the partially of the graphic novel, somewhat of the movie, and obviously the TV series episode 1, the pilot episode. So at this point, if you have not watched or read any of this, feel free to fast forward or go listen to another episode, because we're about to dive right into the thick of it. But so the biggest issue that some people had, and of course with Alan Moore as well, is that in the graphic novel, the way that it ends and comes to a close is that Ozymandias, otherwise known as Mr. V, is a wealthy, powerful businessman at this point. He's arguably the smartest man in the world, as he's referenced to in the graphic novel. And of course the comedian makes the joking line of, eventually if we keep this Cold War up and have a nuclear holocaust, you'll be the smartest man on the tender.
Right.
And so, at the very end, all along throughout the graphic novel, you're being introduced to somewhat of a project that he's been working on with Dr. Manhattan, and ultimately what that ends up being is summoning this fake alien squid-like creature.
Yeah, I've heard it called an interdimensional squid.
Right. That comes to more or less like downtown Manhattan, New York, and causes a psionic or psychic shockwave that disrupts quite a bit and causes quite a bit of chaos, and that also, of course, puts some of the blame partially on Dr. Manhattan. The city has believed that he was the one behind this. How can we trust these quote-unquote superheroes?
Right.
And, of course, that ends up leading directly to a peace agreement between the U.S. and the Soviets. They say, hey, let's drop all this nuclear war. Our main focus needs to be on outlawing these masked vigilantes. Let's come together and sustain peace and avoid the nuclear holocaust that Beat was very much aware was going to come. And so he, of course, was the one pulling all of the strings behind the scenes so that he could benefit from both at the end of the day, as most heroes turned villains often do. So, of course, flip over to Watchmen the movie, and in my personal opinion, I don't know how you feel about it, Charlie, but in my personal opinion, I actually like the flip that they did in the movie. Because instead of a interdimensional squid, which would have been frankly hard to palate for the average moviegoer, I think Hollywood made a good decision in changing it slightly. Because really, like you said to your point earlier, up until that point, it was pretty much a direct script for script, panel for panel adaptation of the graphic novel. But in the end, they changed, instead of a squid, they substitute just a series of nuclear attacks or explosions that are set off that look very Manhattan-esque. Because in the movie, he and Manhattan are working on a machine that he sends over in full at one point to his ice layer, wherever that is, undisclosed location in the world. And so then he eventually enacts that, and it causes all these nuclear explosions, etc., etc. And so then that's what causes the U.S. and the Soviets to realize, hey, whoa, Manhattan's a threat. Anybody that's a superhero or masked vigilante is a threat. Let's stop this right in its tracks. So that's the one big situation that a lot of people will say, oh, well, that wasn't the way that it happened in the graphic novel. The movie got it wrong. Like, it was a perfect movie up until that point.
Yeah, and to that point, Regina King, who plays the main character, Angela Abar, I think is how it's pronounced. There's a scene where she's taking her son home from school, and all of a sudden you hear sirens, and like all the cars stop in the middle of the street, and it starts raining baby squids. And so I can see that, like, if you've read the graphic novel, then yeah, you're going to understand what that's referencing and talking about. And I've heard several people saying that even like that Ozymandias might have something to do with that he like somehow created this and is doing this with the weather just to remind people of what happened and to keep people at check. And so, but if you haven't read the graphic novel, then I could see that part of the episode being very just out there and
sort of strange or odd, like, okay, squids are falling from the sky.
So
kind of random. And everybody's okay with it.
And so that was a big change, or not a big change, but like a big aspect of the show following the graphic novel versus the show following the movie.
I think for me, that was the directors and the creative team making that decision. I feel like when they were creating this TV series, they had to make that decision of, okay, are we going to cherry pick from both the movie and the graphic novel? Are we going to pick up from where the graphic novel left off? Are we going to pick up from where the movie left off? They both more or less leave off from the same place, just with different connotations in the sense that, like we said, obviously one ends with a giant fake alien squid psychic shockwave situation. The other ends with essentially just a series of nuclear explosions caused by, air quote, Dr. Manhattan. So I think for them, this was their message of, hey, just so you guys know, we're picking up from the graphic novel version, and this is where those squids are coming from.
And I will say that I understand why they're not doing it with any of the other characters, but I really kind of hope, especially since it's being hinted at and showing glimpses, if Dr. Manhattan is in this show, I really hope that they either bring Billy Crudup back to play him or at least have him doing the voice of Dr. Manhattan. I know, because that character I don't see aging.
No, not at all. Given the superpowers of Dr. Manhattan, I mean, he's essentially immortal.
Right.
So he's going to exist until even time itself ends. And so, yeah, I think it would be a real treat for Billy Crudup to come back as Dr. Manhattan. And again, they might choose to make him look a little bit differently just because of it being a slightly different show, different version.
Right.
But following the same timeline, same characters, of course, obviously. But it would just be really nice for them to have that somewhat continuity with Crudup doing, at least like you said, the voiceover for Dr. Manhattan, because the way that he did it in the film, I mean, was just perfect. They couldn't have picked a better guy to be Dr. Manhattan, in my opinion. And the way that the show starts, I think, is really interesting because, obviously, of course, this particular TV series speeds up 34 years after the event that took place in 1985, whether it's, your version if you want the squid version or if you want the, multiple nuclear explosions, your choice. But for this particular show, it's very much the squid route.
Mm-hmm.
And so they pick up in 2019, and it's a very different landscape in the United States. Vietnam is actually a U.S. state. We learned that, of course, Detective Angela Abar's character, she actually lived in Vietnam for a time, came back over. But the very beginning of the show starts way back in 1921 in Tulsa, which is where the show is, of course, set in 2019. But we flash back to 1921 and get a little bit of a tragic history lesson as they start in the middle of a very real, actual historical tragedy that was the Tulsa Black Wall Street Massacre, what's also known as the Tulsa Race Riot. Unfortunately, race tensions were very high back in this time period, and it's not pretty early on, but we're introduced right away to this little boy in the theater enjoying kind of a caped hero silent film, if you will. And so his parents pick him up, scoop him up, and say, hey, the town's being raided, we have to get you out of here, let's go, follow your mother. And so then he sends him off, the father, with a little slip of paper. We don't quite see what's on the slip of paper at the beginning.
Right.
And then, of course, they have an unfortunate stagecoach accident. He survives, which I think early on they're trying to hint that maybe this particular child is quote-unquote special, or might maybe have some kind of special abilities, or I don't know if it's super strength or a healing factor or what have you. But he makes it out with his little, I'm assuming, baby sister. He cradles her almost like he's got a sister. There might have been another baby involved in the carriage. They were getting multiple families out at one time.
Right.
Not sure. But then, of course, from that, it flash forwards to a still very racially intense Tulsa, because the first moment we notice, it's a cop pulling over seemingly average celery or lettuce farmer.
Right.
And so then it just kind of takes off from there.
I was going to say, it seems like, the Watchmen, like the graphic novel, was a very social commentary heavy book in that, it talked about the Russians and the Cold War, and this one seems like it's going to be, I don't know that I'd say heavily, judging by the first episode at least, it's going to have an underlying theme or discussion over race relations and civil unrest in this current world that they are living in.
Right, I think we get a little slice of that in Tulsa, and we're also to understand from this episode that this is not the only place where this is happening. This is going on countrywide. It seems very much like a country divided, because there are certain scenes where you notice that there are some Richard Nixon posters, or even I think in one of the trailer parks there is a Richard Nixon kind of
like mural
or statue.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, that's odd, because there have been a lot of other presidents after Nixon in our timeline.
Right.
But of course we have to think of this in the context of this particular storyline.
An alternate U.S.
Right, alternate country, alternate world situation. And because of the incident that occurred back in 1985, Nixon eventually was out of office. And then, of course, Robert Redford is the president in this particular alternate timeline, if you will, and not to be confused, to the best of our knowledge, with the actual actor himself.
So we don't know if it has to do with the actor or if it's just the name that they chose.
We'd like to think not, probably just the name that they chose.
Right.
But so this particular president has been president since 1992.
That's a long time.
It's a long time, so you can tell that, things are very much so different in this version of the United States.
Right.
Because, obviously, politics are quite different. This guy's been president for roughly 30 years, and so it's just like, okay, what's going on here? This is a neat little twist. And one of those, I think, that speaks to the time period and just the alternate timeline of this show is that the police officer that pulls over the quote-unquote lettuce farmer has to ask permission to use his firearm. It's locked in to a gun holster in his car.
Yeah, that was crazy to me when I first saw that.
And so from there, with that particular scene, we find out very quickly that this is not your run-of-the-mill pullover. He knows why he's pulling this particular individual over. I don't want to say that he's profiling him, but he just gets this sense that this guy may be a little bit more than what he's leading on to be.
Right.
Because, of course, he goes through all the questions, very routine. Gentleman that he pulls over acts like everything's fine. Like, oh, yeah, I'll get my license registration out of the glove compartment. Give me just a moment. Do you mind if I reach over there and grab it? And he does. And at that moment, that's when the officer recognizes the kind of tinge of a little bit of a beige or like a Rorschach-esque mask and is like, oh, okay.
Right. Yeah, and you get the impression that there's been I don't know that I'd say cult, but a big following of...
It seems kind of culty.
Of Rorschach, and after the events of the graphic novel / movie, that there was a big organization called the 7th Cavalry that was followers of that situation, and of course, obviously, at the end of the Watchmen, Rorschach's journal gets out, and so we haven't really not a lot has been explained about the outcome of that yet, but with this 7th Cavalry and them wearing the Rorschach mask and everything, obviously there's been some kind of impact.
Yeah, I think it had, unfortunately for Rorschach, unintentional consequences of it falling into the wrong hands, and they get this ideology of his altruistic way of justice.
Right.
They take it to the whole other level, and they actually, it is a pretty neat callback, I will say, in the sense that, because let's be honest here, we're talking about, in this TV series, a white supremacy group.
Right, yeah.
They're not the good guys by any means, but it is a nice callback in the sense that they have the actual first entry by Rorschach of his take on the city as kind of their oath or their creed. And so I thought that was a neat callback for them to do. And there's a number of different callbacks and Easter eggs throughout this first pilot episode. For example, to go back to Regina King, she's in the classroom setting early on because, of course, we find out later in the pilot episode that she is a quote-unquote baker.
Right.
Former police detective turned baker due to events. And so it's just really neat. She cracks a couple eggs into a bowl, and the first two land, and then the third one, she makes the third one into a smile.
Right.
And in one of the first two, it has just a little tinge of blood.
Right.
And so it's that iconic, badge from the comedian that falls off onto the sidewalk and is the actual cover of our trade, both of our trade paperbacks that we have here in front of us. So just a nice little callback there, among others.
Oh, yeah. And it appears that this 7th Cavalry was a prominent group that I'm assuming kind of went away or went into hiding at some point. And with that scene where you see the guy with the mask and everything, they get the impression that this group is, I guess, coming out of hiding or becoming more of a presence again. And so we don't really know a whole lot about them right now, but I'm assuming we'll get more history and more idea of what they're about.
And it seemed to me, in watching the pilot episode in the TV series, that we were given a little bit of a history lesson in that there seemed to have been quite an uproar of, I don't want to say police violence, but certainly situations where they were being attacked or targeted.
Right.
And so whether it was by the 7th Cavalry or just by outraged citizens, etc., or those acting out or lashing out, to the point that it was mandated across the board for each state that if you were going to be in law enforcement, you had to wear some sort of mask or face cover. And that's why now they've also started to revive that masked vigilante side by side working with law enforcement.
Right.
And so that's where, of course, Regina King's character, Detective Angela, comes into play as her codenamed Sister Knight.
Right. And she, like you said, she is a former detective that I believe she got shot, if I remember correctly, but she left the force after that and decided to become a baker. I don't really know where that came from, but it's looking more and more like the baker is just a front to her real job, which is apparently Sister Knight, vigilante / superhero. And so we see that I don't know if you call it her secret kind of like a bat cave type scenario, is within her baking shop or her bakery.
In this case, it'd be a baker cave.
Yeah, I guess you could call it that, yeah. Yeah, so going back to the squid storm scene, she takes her son home, and when she gets home, her husband tells her, oh, you've gotten this beep on your pager for the last little while, and she looks at it, and it says Little Bighorn on it, and apparently that's code for something, because she says, oh, I gotta go to the bakery, and so she leaves her husband and goes to the bakery, and we come into contact for the first time with Louis Gossett Jr.'s character, which is named...
I believe, according to the Wikipedia page, the character's actual name is Will Reeves, but we see him first as just this elderly paraplegic, and we find out some pretty big information about him towards the end, but we want to talk about a few points before we get to that surprise.
Right, and so when she gets there and comes across him, he asks her a question, and we can tell that there's more to him, but in that scene, he just seems like an old guy just sitting there not doing anything. But anyway, so she goes into her bat cave or her baker cave and changes and leaves and goes and picks up this character that looks like, typical redneck white supremacist type guy.
Kind of fits the profile as a potential 7th Cavalry member, we'll say that.
Right, and so she takes him and goes to the police station where we see Don Johnson giving a talk to the police. And at the end of his presentation that he's giving to the police force, we move into the office of Don Johnson where he has a conversation with Regina King's character.
Right, he and Night Sister have a meeting in his office, and of course Don Johnson plays the chief of police, Judd Crawford, of the town, of the Tulsa police force, and we get another little nifty Easter egg where you really kind of have to be looking for it on his desk. It's a book, and it's not just any book, it's Under the Hood, which was written by the original Night Owl numero uno, and that of course being Hollis Mason. And of course if you've read the graphic novel, you are able to get snippets of that in the original graphic novel by Alan Moore. And of course, he is surprised to see Night Sister there sitting in his chair, and he of course starts to question her, like, well, what are you doing here? What brings you into the office? And so of course she fires back and says, well, given the situation that happened with the police officer being shot last night, why wasn't I called? I don't get a Little Bighorn beeper message until 2 p.m. the next day. And so you start to wonder a little bit about this police chief. It's like, well, if he's got this detective, you would think he would want to let her know and keep her abreast of situations. Seems like if it's a need-to-know basis, seems like she's somebody that needs to know about this.
Right.
And so of course he again says, well, that doesn't answer my question as to what you're doing here. What have you done? And she's like, well, I was being proactive.
Right.
It sounds to me like this has 7th Cavalry written all over it, so I went to the source. I've got somebody in for questioning before anybody else could get out onto the streets and get the wrong person or try to turn this into something else that it's not.
Right.
So why don't we start asking this guy questions and seeing if we can get answers? And so he says, yeah, you know what, let's take him to the pod. And so the pod is essentially this subliminal chamber.
Yeah, it was really weird.
Yeah, but they subject, I don't know if it's just 7th Cavalry members or everybody that they interrogated this police department, but it seems to be, to them, a highly effective method because they use different imagery and repetitive questions to try and trick, much the way that they would in a good cop, bad cop situation. In a normal interrogation room, they try to talk to you in such a way to get a confession out of you.
Right.
And so, of course, that's where we get introduced to Tim Blake Nelson's character, who is codenamed Looking Glass, and he's kind of got this really neat, cool, reflective mask that essentially shields his face, because we're also led to believe that not only are police officers masking themselves, but of course police chiefs, detectives, etc. are also wearing some sort of mask, or if you're a masked vigilante, you blend in as well with the police force.
Did the police? I didn't see the police chief wear one.
He was the one that actually did not have a mask. So I suppose if you're a certain elected official or maybe higher ranking official, maybe you get a pass, or it's hard not to conceal yourself.
Or on the same token, that could be why we see what eventually happens.
Correct. Yeah, towards the end, that might exactly be why he's so easily targeted.
Right.
And so, of course, from there, they try to get information out of him the polite way and fail. He's a pretty tough cookie to crack. They know more or less that he's not being truthful or that he is a part of this particular organization, the
Right.
7th Cavalry. And so, of course, Regina King's character, that doesn't sit too well with her. She needs information, she needs it now. And so we get another callback, sort of a back-to-back callback, and she takes him into another room by herself and proceeds to beat the answers out of him and beats him, what we presume to be to his death, because there's, I'm assuming, standing water or some kind of puddle of water in this room, and it comes out of the swinging door and then followed swiftly turned red by blood.
Yeah, which was a little much, in my opinion, but...
A little bit, but like I said, it's also that nice callback to the movie.
Right.
In that Rorschach has to take care of some business, or I think you might say, I have to use the restroom, and he takes out the crime boss in the toilet and smashes his head into a toilet seat, and of course water initially comes out at first, and then it is turned red.
Right, which I kind of thought it was a little bit much in the movie as well, but, I mean, honestly, you know, how big is this room and how much blood is being spilled, but anyway...
And so, of course, from there, they figure out their hideout, and so they go and try to infiltrate and take out the 7th Cavalry, or at least cut off one of the heads.
Right.
And so they're semi-successful. They're able to get a couple people. We find out very quickly that some of them have taken the Ozymandias approach, in that they have these cyanide or suicide pills, to where, of course, the messenger in the movie, another, again, callback.
Right.
There's a lot of Easter eggs throughout this particular pilot, especially for those that watch the movie or read the graphic novel, so you will really appreciate it when you watch it.
I would recommend either watching the movie or reading the graphic novel, one or the other, before watching this. Otherwise, it's going to be very...
You're going to have a lot more questions than answers.
Right.
That's for sure. But so they're of course heavily equipped to deals with all kinds of ammunition, firearms, etc. And they have these pills just in case they get caught. They're going to take themselves out, and they are loyal to the core, to their cause. And before that, it's kind of odd, they're pulling apart watches for the lithium batteries on the inside.
Right.
Because we're told earlier in the show, in the pilot episode, that these particular... Actually, it's not earlier, it's after they are caught, and they are like, why do they have all these lithium batteries? It's because that particular type of watch was outlawed because they found out that over time it was causing some form of cancer or some
watch or the battery?
The battery.
Yeah.
The lithium was causing some sort of cancer or disease, and so they did away with that style of watch. And so you almost wonder if they're trying to make some kind of chemical warfare, or like medical or viral warfare, out of these, making like maybe lithium bombs, more or less. And so, of course, we get one of the last callbacks, and that is as they are trying to chase them in the plane that had the lithium batteries in the bag, they use the sort of a hybrid police version of the Night Owl's ship.
Right. Archimedes, I think is what it's called.
Correct.
After the owl.
Yep.
Which, I mean, I liked it. I liked the callback, but at the same time, this plane / helicopter or whatever it is, not very aerodynamic.
No, it requires a lot of jet propulsion to be efficient.
And
but
just the shape of it doesn't seem like it would, promote very good flight.
No, and oddly enough, of course, in the plane chase scene, they take out their target. But in doing so, of course, Don Johnson's character, Judd Crawford, the police chief, gets a little too ambitious.
Right.
And it ends up malfunctioning, and it does its own nosedive into the field.
Right.
And of course, Detective Abar goes over thinking that maybe the police chief is injured or worse, and tries to kick in the eyeglass of the front windshield there to no effect. They're able to rip off the door, climb out. They have a little laugh about it, like, can you believe that? What a crazy night, And so they have that ease of weight off their shoulders, like, well, we may not have been able to apprehend everybody that we wanted, but we've gotten some more answers as to what their plans are. We've at least got our foot in the door to see a starting point for our search to try and get this taken care of before it gets out of hand. And then from there, the show starts to really wind down a little bit. We're towards the end of the pilot episode, and we think everything's all right. Well, again, we're on the right track to hunting these guys down, but we need to do more research.
Right.
But we're going to call it tonight at night. And just before the night is over, of course, Detective Abar gets a phone call from an unknown assailant, if you want to call it that knows who she is, knows where she lives, and says, hey, come meet me, I've got your boss. Because, of course, before that, the police chief gets a call and goes out to take the call and tries to figure out a situation or see what's going on. He thinks,
he ends up, basically after all that happens, Regina King's character and Don Johnson's character, which are the police chief and Angela, you get the picture that they've been good friends for a while, and so both of their families are having dinner together, and and you have this nice little family time moment, and then when she goes home, Don Johnson character tells his wife that he's gonna go see the police officer that was originally shot. Apparently he's awake, and as the police chief he wants to go and visit him and see how he is. And so that's where he's going when he leaves his house.
Of course, unfortunately, he doesn't make it.
Right.
So someone throws out some tire tracks, stops the SUV right in its tracks, SUV truck, whatever vehicle he's in. Mm-hmm. And so then right away, okay, something bad's about to happen to him.
Right.
All the meanwhile, of course, Regina King's character gets that phone call. Mm-hmm. And of course, she finds out, hey, I've got your boss. And so she immediately, gets her guns at the ready, tells her husband, don't, answer the door for anybody. If anyone but me comes up in that driveway, shoot at him. Keep the kids safe. I've got to take care of this. And so she goes to this open field, nice little tree setting. And lo and behold, all to loop back to, Sir in the wheelchair, Mr. Will Reeves.
Right.
We see, so at the very beginning of the podcast, in the very beginning of this episode, this pilot episode for Watchmen, we mentioned that the little boy from the Tulsa Black Wall Street Massacre was given a piece of paper by his father that said, watch over this boy or watch this boy. And so it's this gentleman that's the paraplegic elderly man in the wheelchair holding that very same piece of paper. So you start to connect the dots and realize, oh wow, this is that same kid.
Right.
And of course, we mentioned her going into the, air quotes, bakery that's also her bakery cave, or her little baker by day, vigilante by night hideout. And she sees him in the wheelchair and he's making conversation, says, oh, when's the bakery going to be open? And she says soon. And he's like, oh, okay, I'll wait. And then he asks her a random question, as most townies often do. He says, do you think I can lift 200 pounds? And she says, no, just kind of get the conversation over with way like, yeah, I'm sure you could. Like, almost have a nice day, I don't have time to talk to you.
Right.
Which is funny when you get to the end of the episode, because it's roughly about, what the police chief would probably presumably weigh. Right. And that's exactly who you see strung up and hung up in the tree.
Right. And he's sitting below him, and it's just, you get the picture that there's more to this little boy turned old man, because come to find out he's like 105 years old. And I mean, and like you said, him asking that question, do you think I could lift 200 pounds? Something's going on with him. There's got to be more to him than meets the eye.
Right. It's a great way to end the pilot episode, because the show itself ends with a lot of questions, and so you're enticed to what's going on. Does this old man have superpowers?
Right.
Is he going to be important throughout the entire show? How does he know Regina King's character, Detective Abar? Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of questions, and so I'm glad it ended the way that it did. And we get one last really good callback, and that is it does this slow pan up the tree to the police chief, and then a slow pan down all the way to the grass, and there's his sheriff's badge. And it also calls back to itself. In the very beginning of the episode, it shows this well-to-do caped masked vigilante taking out their town's sheriff, saying he wasn't worthy of his badge, he needs to be punished. Same concept applies for the police chief here, at least so that's implied.
Right.
We don't really know if he's done anything wrong one way or the other, but it's implied that he may be...
Yeah, several things happen throughout the episode that lead you to believe that he may not be the most upstanding character.
And so, of course, you get the close-in shot of the badge, and then just a little drop of blood goes across it, much in the same way that the comedian's smiley face pin badge, whatever you want to call it, also got in the movie, and of course in the comic book graphic novel as well. So that was a nice way to close the show. But one thing before we close this podcast episode that I did want to talk about that we forgot to go over through all the mist of our earlier conversation was the introduction of Jeremy Irons as Adrian Beat, and him being a lord of a country manor, and certainly being the older version of Ozymandias. But to the best of our knowledge, in this pilot episode, all news that we hear is that Ozymandias is dead.
Right. You see a newspaper just in a random scene earlier in the episode, and the headlines say Adrian Beat pronounced dead or something to that effect. And so we don't really know what's going on with him. He does have apparently his butler and his maid are the only two people in his life, it looks like, while he's at this, this castle / manor that he lives in. He has a couple of different odd exchanges with them, and so I'm very interested to see more of that, which it looks like he's going to be a much bigger part in the series going forward. When they show, at the very end, they show things to come type scene or splice of scenes.
Right, and that's where we figure out that, Will Reeves, this particular paraplegic survivor in the wheelchair, he tells Regina King's character, right, Detective Abar, that he's 105 years old because she guesses that he's 90. She's trying to figure out how in the world he was able to hang the police chief.
Right.
And so he corrects her and says, I'm not 90, I'm 105, and you need to watch your language.
Right. And so, overall, there were some odd moments, but it was a very interesting pilot episode, and like you said, it leaves you with a lot more questions than answers, which, honestly, if you have a show that you're interested in, then that's definitely going to bring you back next week to watch the next episode.
Right, so, and that's how you I feel like that's how you would want the pilot to go.
Right, and I think they did a very good job of doing that. I will definitely be continuing to watch, and I would recommend it. I recommend it for anybody that's either seen the movie or read the graphic novel, or both.
And I was going to say, fans of either, I think, are going to enjoy this show a lot more so than just your average TV show viewer, because it is just so well done. There are a number of callbacks to both the movie and the graphic novel as well, and so I'll be interested to see how these episodes progress, if Dr. Manhattan will end up being a key character. There's, of course, a list of the episodes available on the Wikipedia page, and I feel like if we had to guess or predict or theorize when he might show up, there's going to be a total of 9 episodes in all, and so the last 3 titles are as follows: Episode 7, An Almost Religious Awe; Episode 8, A God Walks into a Bar; and then let's see, before that, actually, I went in backwards order here, so Episodes 6 through 8, I would theorize is probably when we'll see, if at all, Dr. Manhattan. Episode 6 is This Extraordinary Being. That would be an appropriate time to introduce Dr. Manhattan. As I already mentioned, Episode 7 will be An Almost Religious Awe, and Episode 8 will be A God Walks into a Bar. So I feel like sometime between Episodes 6 and 8 is probably when we would get that Dr. Manhattan introduction, but they may save that for Season 2, and they were just giving us a little teaser of his hand in that scenes to come, episodes to come teaser.
You see him in that, as well as for the trailer for this show before it started. At the very end of the trailer, you see a glimpse of the back of Dr. Manhattan, or somebody that has blue skin. I can only imagine that it would be Dr. Manhattan. So they've definitely done a good job in teasing that without giving anything away or even really touching on it. I know that that's one aspect that is going to keep me watching, is the prospect of seeing him. So what would you rate this first episode?
Oh, well, okay, so we're going to give this a true nerdy by nature rating.
Yeah,
okay,
sure.
All right, why not? I would say for a pilot, and for it to be new, for it to be on HBO, it was on par with the other shows that I've watched, such as Westworld or Game of Thrones, etc., etc. I would give it a solid 3.5. I don't want to say 4, because it's not a pilot that blew me away to where I was like, I can't wait to watch episode 2.
Right.
This is one that I could very well binge. It's going to be a very binge-worthy show, say around the holidays. But I don't want to say they didn't quite do enough for me to be like, oh, I've got to tune in every Sunday. For me, personally, I think that would be worthy of a 4, or even a 5 for our TV show rankings. But I think definitely a 3.5, because we are fans of the movie and the graphic novel, and we enjoyed it quite a bit. It's a very watchable pilot, and I hope that the episodes will continue to get better and better and have aha moments, or moments that make you want to tune in to start every Sunday. So for me, I would say a 3.5 nerd.
Okay. I would, just because of the teasing they've done and how they've set everything up, I would say 4.
Oh, okay.
Personally, just because I will be watching every week, at least for the next few weeks. If things go off the rails, then that'll be one thing. But just going off of the pilot, just my interest in the show is way up there right now. But I will also say that we're not going to cover every episode.
Just to be clear, I say we're doing this pilot review, and we might do a mid-season review, say episode 5 or 6, and then of course for the season finale, obviously, if we're still watching and interested, and everyone doesn't have have too much of a gripe over the show,
right,
or there's not too much controversy, which I don't anticipate there being, we'll of course do in true Nerdy by Nature fashion a recap of the season and a season finale review, especially to see how it ends. I'm assuming it'll probably be a cliffhanger.
Right.
If we get a renewal for season 2, that'll be interesting to see. So it'll be really neat to watch this show develop.
Definitely, and I don't know that there's a way to do it right now, or if anything's even been said about doing it, but I would also be interested to see if they at all touch on or decide to bring in aspects of the new comic run Doomsday Clock.
That would be fun.
Yeah, because that would bring in, like all of the DC superhero characters. So I think that would be a very exciting and good way to pull people back in if they did that. Now, like I said, that's pure speculation, pure just what I would want to see. Nothing's been said that I've seen anywhere or anything like that. So,
but that's something that would bring me back every Sunday.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
I'm not, as you know, I'm not a big TV series guy.
Right.
So that's why I tend to usually binge my shows more. I'll watch a bunch of episodes in a weekend and catch up, as opposed to trying to watch one every night a week or pick a day of the week to watch a TV show. So that would bring me back every Sunday if I knew they were not only doing Watchmen characters, but bringing in some of our favorite DC characters as well, that the Doomsday Clock series does.
Right, and the fact that HBO and more than likely DC Universe is going to be combining in a streaming service in the future, I would say that that's probably not out of the realm of possibility, honestly.
No, it could be a match made in heaven on down the road.
So I would be very interested, and I almost want to say that I kind of hope that happens,
We can hope.
Yeah.
We're always allowed to hope.
Right.
And so with that is going to wrap up this edition of Nerdy by Nature. As always, we thank you for listening. Of course, feel free to hit the like button, share this with anybody that you think would enjoy the show, or have them share it with anybody that they think would enjoy the show. Feel free to comment, let us know what we got right, what we got wrong, things that you would like to hear, or just to have open discussions. We are always open to having that discussion with you, the listener, and it's easily the funnest part of doing a podcast.
Definitely.
And with that being said, of course, our next episode, we're going to stay along the same lines that we've been here with this Watchmen series. We, of course, in this podcast went over the pilot episode that just aired on HBO, Watchmen. Feel free to go ahead and give that a shot, dive in, and watch it with us. And also, of course, we went over slightly the graphic novel and the movie, Watchmen, same name. So we're going to stick on that same train with Alan Moore. And this time, since November is right around the corner, we thought it'd be appropriate to go ahead and do a review of V for Vendetta, the graphic novel, as well as V for Vendetta, the movie. And so that episode will be on the way this next Friday around. Of course, it'll be right before the 5th of November, so unfortunately it would have been nice for it to work out for the 5th of November to fall on a Friday, but it's on a Tuesday, so we're going to try and get ahead of the game and do that full review for you. And we look forward to doing that episode because it's personally one of my favorite graphic novels. And so with that, again, we thank you for listening. Signing off, I'm Agent Smith.
And I'm Captain Rogers. God bless.